everybody, this is Mike Curley. Welcome back to the C Team. Today we're talking again about the Dresden Files RPG, and today we're going to talk about conflicts. Now, conflicts are any extended scene where, well, two groups or more are going at it with each other, either physically, mentally, or socially. And yes, there are different types of conflicts. Physical is probably the most common, so that's kind of where I'm going to frame things today. But mechanically, physical, mental, and social conflicts all work the same way, and I'm going to go over each of them in brief to start off. So first, physical conflict. That's pretty obvious. That's your fights. That's pretty much all it is. It's your fights. Any action scene you can remember from the books or the movies, that is a physical conflict. Now, social conflicts, those are a bit trickier to categorize. Those are things like parties, even individual conversations or performances. These are things where you're not putting your body on the line, but more your reputation, where you want to get somebody to do something, but you're risking your own embarrassment or scandal or something like that. Now, mental conflicts it's actually kind of rare to have an even mental conflict. Most of the mental conflicts or the mental damage you'll take in the system are either self-inflicted in the case of spellcasters, or things like one side attacking the other in the case of certain powers like Incite Emotion or the domination powers that certain vampires would have. So it's kind of rare to have an actual conflict mentally, but I've seen some GMs, and I've done this myself, where something in a soul gaze or something purely mental manifests as a mental conflict. Now, there are certain things that you want to set up and have in mind as you're setting up a conflict scene. So the first is, what is the type of conflict and what are the stakes? What are you fighting over? Now, it's easy to say, oh, you're fighting a life or death, but not all fights are going to be about that. Some of them are going to be just you're fighting to get out of the room, or you're fighting to get a certain artifact, you're fighting to get certain information. So you want to keep these stakes in mind as you go in so you know what to risk. And something I want to mention here is, in the Dresden Files and the Fate system, death is not automatic. There isn't any threshold of damage past which a physical attack will kill, and there's no particular type of attack that must result in death by the rules as written. So whether death happens in the game at all is something that you're going to want to talk to your GM about, and the GM's going to want to get this kind of on the table before any dice are rolled, before even characters are rolled. And when it can happen, if you are in a game where death is a possibility, where everybody's agreed to it, the GM should kind of make this obvious when you're going into a scene. Have the characters described as, he's looking at you with a deadly glint in your eye. Something like that, so that all the players involved know what they're risking if they continue the fight. And when I say risking, I mean not just participating in the fight, because we'll go into this later, but there are mechanisms to make sure you don't die even if you jump into a fight with someone who wants to kill you. Okay, once you've got all that out of the way, the next thing to look at is, where is everybody? And in Dresden combat, it's typically divided into zones, which are kind of just loosely where everybody's in melee range. It's not like other systems where you're calculating specifically which square you're on, how much movement you have. It's more, okay, you're all in the room, you're all within melee range, give or take. Now, you could have a larger area that has several zones, and that affects what tactics are available to you and what actions you can take, and ranged versus melee weapons. But generally speaking, in one zone means you're within a few seconds of hitting somebody. Next, you're going to want to decide initiative. Now, as the rules is written, it's not something you roll for, but it's just your alertness rating, the skill that we talked about in the last video. So if you have a higher alertness, you're going sooner. Certain powers, like the speed powers, will bump this up even more. I believe in human speed, the lowest level gives you a +4 in alertness for initiative. So I like to use note cards that I have everybody's initiative or alertness rating written on the top so I can organize them really quickly. But it's something, figure out what you're going to do, because this generally does not change unless the players change it. Now, there is an option, of course, to roll for it. If you want to do that, that's totally fine. Or if you just want to do it in situations where, say, there's an ambush or everybody's by surprise and who gets to react quickest. That's a nice way to mix things up. There's other methods, but it's kind of loosely defined. Rules as written is you take the alertness ratings or whatever works for you at the table at the time. Okay, now that you know when everybody's going, now we'll get into the actions you can take during combat. And the first and most obvious one, of course, is to attack. Now, this is obviously to do stress or damage with the goal of taking somebody out. And the way it works is the attacker rolls something like fists, weapons, or guns are the typical ones, and the target rolls defense. Now, that roll determines whether or not the attack hits, and a tie goes to the attacker. To decide the amount of damage, you take the attack roll, you add any weapon ratings, so if you have a sword or a gun, that adds to it, and you subtract the defense roll and any armor rating, and that gives you the total number. Now, other skills can work depending on the situation or stunts. I've had characters in my games that if they were using an improvised weapon, they could use craftsmanship. Or if they tried to, duck out of the way to make somebody hit themselves in the head by running past, use athletics. It's sort of a situational thing and sort of a sell it to your GM thing. So, again, it's a very malleable system, but those are the big three: fists, weapons, and guns. Okay, so the next thing you can do is a maneuver, and this is where you create a temporary aspect either on yourself, on the environment, or an opponent. And it works sort of similar to attack when you're working on an opponent, where you roll a certain skill, and here it's almost anything you can make sense. You could still use fists, weapons, or guns if you're using a weapon or something attack-like throwing them to the ground. You could also use athletics. You could also roll craftsmanship to mess with the lights, or intimidation to create a taunting aspect on somebody. It's sort of something you want to sell to your GM. If you're maneuvering against an enemy, like the attack, it's maneuver versus defense. And if there's a difference of +1, if you roll a 4 and your opponent rolls a 3, then it's a sticky aspect. And that means it remains until either it's deliberately undone or it stops making sense. There are certain things you can do where if you knock somebody over and then on the next turn they roll athletics to run 3 zones, clearly they got up in the meantime. On a tie, again, it still goes to the attacker, it still goes to the person doing the maneuver, but then it's a fragile aspect. That means it gets tagged once and then it goes away. So if you were trying to trip them and you got an even and a tie, that means they're not tripped, maybe they're stumbling a little bit, so the very next person who tries to attack them can take a swing at them, but after that they've regained their footing. And again, you can also create an aspect on yourself or your allies, and this is usually easier. You can roll discipline to concentrate and boost yourself for the next spell, or use rapport to create a aspect to fire up an ally, or a helping aspect. Those don't have the opposed roll, they generally have a lower difficulty of 2 or 3. I think 3 is the standard in the book, so those are a little safer to give yourself a boost. Now you could also create a maneuver and an aspect in the environment. You could do things like shut off the lights, knock over something to create a slippery surface, set something on fire, something that affects everything around you but not the people, so therefore it doesn't get a defense roll. It's usually, again, like a difficulty of 3, maybe 4 or 5 if it's something particularly difficult, if you're going to go swinging from the chandelier to knock it down. This is generally up to the GM's discretion. Now on the defensive side of things, you can set up what's called a block. And this is where you try to stop something from happening. Typically, you're either trying to stop a lot of people from doing one thing, such as you put up your shield to stop anybody from attacking your partner, or you stop one person from doing a lot of things. So there, you take the same shield, but you shove it in somebody's face to keep him from attacking or maneuvering or moving. There are some exceptions and some wiggle room and gray area, as there always are, but that's kind of the ground rule. If you're stopping one action, you can affect a lot of people. If you're stopping one person, you can affect a lot of the things he's doing. And an important thing to remember is, unlike maneuvers and attacks, this is not an opposed roll. When you create a block, nobody rolls to stop you. Instead, you roll to set the difficulty of the action you're blocking. So, say you're trying to keep people out of a room. You roll might to keep the door closed. So you roll a 4. Therefore, anybody who wants to get in the room, they need to get past that 4 to get into the room. So nobody is stopping you from setting it up. Even if you roll abysmally and it's a terrible block, you can still do that and maybe stop somebody or slow them down. Now, one obvious use for blocks is to block attacks. And if it's overcome there, the person who was being blocked for gets a defense roll as well. So for example, you have your paladin type, rolls his weapons to block a vampire from attacking his buddy, the wizard. And the paladin gets a 4. Now if the vampire rolls an attack for a 5, that gets through the block. But the wizard still gets a chance to roll a defense because there's always the chance he's going to roll high. But whatever happens, you take the highest result. So if the wizard rolls and gets a 2, then he still gets the benefit of that 4 block that his buddy put up. Now there is a special type of block called a grapple. That works a little differently because it's one-on-one, and first you need an aspect that you can either tag or invoke to set it up. Either tag that your buddy tripped them, or even something that you've already assessed but used, you could spend a fate point for it. Now this is rolled with might and acts as a block on every action the target attempts. If he tries to run, if he tries to attack, if he tries to cast a spell, do a maneuver, they can't do that unless they beat your block. So this has potential to really lock somebody down. They also can't move from the zone until the block is broken. And on subsequent turns, the grappler gets a couple extra actions. As a supplemental action, which we're going to go over in a little bit, they can do 1 shift of damage or add a maneuver at the cost of a penalty to maintaining the block. And that's something you can wear somebody down over time. You're choking them out or you're maneuvering them in some way. It's tough to pull off and you kind of need to build your character for this, but sometimes it can be a game changer. Now the other main action you can do on your turn is to sprint, and that's moving from zone to zone. Generally you roll athletics, and each shift that you get is another zone you can move. So if you roll a 3 on athletics, you can move 3 zones away, which puts you a significant distance from harm or towards somebody. Now borders can get in the way. You might have a chain link fence that the GM decides, oh, that's a 2-shift border, so you need a 2 or higher to get into the next zone. So that's something you can use offensively or defensively. You can create choke points, but it's something that the characters have to get around. And if there is a border, then you can't move as a supplemental action. You can only move by getting over the border. Okay, so what happens if it's your turn and you don't really want to do anything? You have a couple options here. One, you could just go full defense. And that means you get a +2 to any defense on your roll until your next turn. So that's where you don't really have anything productive you can do, but you can turtle up, avoid damage, and you can kind of sit there. The other thing is you can wait to interrupt, which means you can wait for somebody else to declare their action, for example, an enemy, and say, okay, I want to actually take my turn here, interrupt. I want to shoot him before he does that. So whenever it's your turn, you don't have to do something. You can wait it out, and if you do interrupt, that's where your turn takes place now. So you can change up the order a little bit. So if you rolled really, really badly on initiative, you can wait until you're going before the enemies on the next round. Now, supplemental actions. Those are additional kind of not quite free actions like talking, but there's something that you can do in addition to your roll. Something like drawing a gun or closing a door or making a quick assessment. It's kind of a fine line. It's something you wouldn't really roll for, but which is significant enough to kind of distract you from the main thing you're doing. And the way it works is when you take a supplemental action, it's a -1 penalty to whatever your main action is. So the most common one is moving from zone to zone. So say you're a gunfighter, you're in a fight, and you want to move from one zone outside the saloon to inside the saloon. The door is open, so there's no border. So you can fire shots at a -1 penalty to your normal roll to get behind cover and get into the next zone. So now we got to get into the nitty-gritty of what happens with stress and consequences and how you take damage and actually resolve the conflict. And again, this is a mechanic that works through all 3, so mainly I'm going to be talking about physical because that's the most common one. So Dresden and Fate do not have hit points. They don't have like a health system there. You take stress, which kind of represents your close calls. How much, not damage, but how close you have been to getting damaged. And for the most part, absent powers, you're going to have a stress track of 2 to 4 boxes, and any successful attack will do stress. So if an attack does an amount of stress that falls within the stress track, so say you take a 3-shift hit when you have 4 boxes, then that's it. You take the stress. It stays as damage until the character gets a breather, but doesn't otherwise affect your performance. You are no less good at shooting when you take a 3-shift hit than before you did. Now, an important thing to remember is if a second attack does the same amount of damage, it rolls up. So you took that 3-shift hit. If the next round you take another 3-shift hit, that becomes a 4-shift hit. And this stacks. So if you have your second and third stress box filled, and you take a 2-shift hit, then that's a 4-shift hit. So it kind of, you start running out of luck the more hits you take. And it's important to note here that a hit mechanically, if you take stress, doesn't mean a hit narratively. So guns, for example, most handguns in the system are weapon 2. That means if you take an even hit, if you roll a 4 to attack and they do a 4 to defend and you hit them for 2 stress, they're not going to get taken out. They're not going to get any real damage. They'll take the 2 stress. Now that doesn't mean that you shot them and they just somehow didn't take damage. That means maybe you grazed past their ear or you fired over their cover and they're getting freaked out. That's an important thing to remember because it can get confusing sometimes where you hit somebody but you don't really hit them. But it's important to remember for something I'm going to talk about when we get to taking out somebody. And stress does not last. You don't have to do a dedicated action. You just kind of need a breather. It's kind of like you had a close call, you're breathing heavily. If you take a moment to take your breath, if you have, a 5-minute break, you clear the stress track entirely. It doesn't have to be long, it just has to be a distinct break in the action. Okay, so what happens when the stress you take goes past the stress track? When you take a 5-shift hit, for example, or even if you take a 3-shift hit that rolls past your filled 3rd and 4th boxes and becomes a 5th-shift hit. So when that happens, you're taken out. And what happens is the attacking character decides what happened. They decide whether you're knocked out, killed, tied up, or knocked out a window. Whatever happens, if you get taken out, you're not participating in this battle anymore. And it's kind of two-sided because the attacker decides what happens, but the victim gets a say in the details. So if you die, for instance, the victim gets to say any last words. If they're embarrassed out of a social conflict, they get to say, okay, I put my napkin down and I leave. As opposed to the attacker can't say, okay, you run screaming from the room like a little girl. So it's kind of a back and forth, provided it makes sense. And again, I want to note here, this is not a system where death can happen by accident. Like I said before, the attacker gets to decide, he has full control of how the defending character goes down. And it doesn't matter what happened to make that happen. Even if the attack that takes them out is some nuclear fire beam that does 20 shifts of damage to somebody who only had 2 stress boxes, you are totally free to narrate that you fired around him and he freaked out. Or the fire consumed the oxygen in the room and he passed out. Now, your GM might compel this before or after to say, look, you hit him with a fireball, he should be dead. But that's something, by the rules as written, you get to decide. And that's important for everybody around the table to remember. I have had situations where character took someone out with the guns, but before he really realized it, he said, oh, I wanted to interrogate them, and I had to remind him, you can just decide you shot him in the knees out of the fight. Now, again, this goes back to what I was saying before. You want to make sure the stakes are clear when the conflict starts. Now, there is a way out of it, or at least to delay it, and that's called consequences. Consequences are a way to avoid being taken out, but they come with a significant price, so it's kind of up to you to decide in the moment. If an attack goes past your stress track, say you take a 5-shift hit, and you want to keep fighting, you could take a consequence that reduces the hit to put it back on your stress track and keep fighting. And you can take multiples in a single hit, so if you take a 7-shift hit that puts you 3 hits above your stress track, you can take multiple consequences to reduce it. But the catch is each one is an aspect. And this can be compelled and it can be tagged by whoever hit you. So if you take a consequence to keep fighting, the next round you can expect your opponent to tag it for a boost to his next attack. Now there are 4 types. There is mild, moderate, severe, and extreme, and that's all you get. You get 1 for all of your stress tracks at each level, unless one of your stats that defines that stress track is 5 or above. Then you get extras and there are some stunts, but for the most part you get 1 that you have to share among all of them. So if you take a physical mild consequence, you cannot then take a mental mild consequence. So they stack and it kind of ramps up really quickly. Now, a mild consequence reduces a hit by 2. And these are the lightest ones. They typically go away on their own at the end of the next scene. If you want to think of it in terms of these are things you can walk off. These are like, okay, you hit your shoulder, but you can roll it and you're fine when you have a breather. This is something that might hinder you in the moment, like a rolled ankle might impact your athletics rolls for this scene, but once you have a chance to sit down and take care of it for a minute, you're going to be fine. Now the next level is moderate, and this reduces it by 4. These are a little more severe. These, by the rules as written, go away at the end of the next session. I like to look at it as after a few days because I've had a lot of sessions where you'll have 6 sessions that take place within a couple hours in game. So these are the kinds of things you're going to start needing actual medical attention for. Maybe not necessarily a hospital, but someone with a first aid kit is going to want to look at this. These are light cuts, a black eye, a first-degree burn maybe. Something you can't really just walk off, but it's going to hurt and impact you for a couple days. For mental consequences, this is the area where you're going to start doing like self-care things, like going for a hike to clear your mind, talking to friends, eating a bucket of ice cream. Something that you're taking a deliberate effort to deal with the trauma you've dealt with. Now the third is severe, and this reduces things by 6 stress points, by 6 shifts. These can last an entire scenario, or I like to look at it as several weeks or months. This is where you've got more holes in you than you're supposed to, or something's bending that's not supposed to. This is broken bones, gunshot wounds, things you need to go to a hospital for. These are going to impact your character's ability to perform for a while. Now, mental consequences, this is something you're going to want to, get a dedicated mental health professional, psychiatrist, medication, something very deliberate, very long-term to get over this. Now, the last one that is the rarest because it is a big one. It's called the extreme consequence. This reduces it by 8. And this doesn't have its own aspect that it creates. This permanently changes one of your character aspects. One of the 5 character building aspects we went through in the first video. This is getting hit so hard, it changes who you are. This might be you lose a limb. Or it might create a phobia. If you're familiar with the books, in Deadbeat, when Harry has his charred and burned hand and he's afraid of using his own fire magic, that was an extreme consequence. This is something that doesn't go away on a time schedule. Even if the physical part heals, this is something you're going to need to do a dedicated task, character development, a major milestone in your character. And even when it heals, you can change the aspect, but you can't change it back to what it was. This is something where you went to the wall in a fight. You were this close to death, but it was important enough to you that it hurt you in the soul. One good example I saw once on the forums is it doesn't nearly need to be an actual physical trauma. An extreme consequence for somebody who is a total non-action person, say like an accountant, might be they get stabbed in the gut, which might be a severe or a moderate for your Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger types. But because it hurt him so badly in mentally and other fashions, this might be an extreme consequence that makes him paranoid or makes him want to get his own gun. So this one is not necessarily tied to how much actual physical trauma it is, but it hurts the character sheet. Now there is another alternative to taking consequences called a concession, which is where you still lose the fight, but you lose it on your terms. And it's kind of very similar to a taken out, where, again, if you concede, you're not participating in this battle anymore, but you're the one who decides what happens. So typically there are some guidelines. You can only really offer a concession if you've already taken a moderate or higher consequence, or if the object of the battle has already kind of been decided, where you realize, okay, we can't stop them from getting the idol anymore. There's no sense in throwing ourselves into this meat grinder anymore. The thing is, you have to call for concession before any attack roll that would have taken your character out. So you can't sit there and say, oh, there's no way I'm defending against that 8, so I'm going to concede, because that robs the attacker of their legitimate victory. So it's more like, I worry the next attack could kill me, so I'm going to concede. It's something you have to call for proactively. And once you call for it, it's a negotiation. You're going out on your terms, but you still have to lose something. You have to lose that idol. The bad guys have to get away. You have to take a significant drawback. Otherwise, it's kind of toothless. If you're trying to stop a ritual in this fight, then you don't stop it. Whatever you were trying to stop happens. So it is consequential. The main thing is this is to avoid death. And that is the main benefit, to avoid death. If the enemy has signaled that he wants to kill you, if he's a vampire or a ghoul and you have no reason to expect mercy, you can call for concession and say, oh, his next hit kicks me out the window, so I survive. On the other side, GMs, if you want your villain to be a recurring villain, be ready to hammer the concede button. I've had players who are dead set on murdering and executing my villains that I had long plots for, so I start offering concessions kind of as soon as it's necessary once I see that gleam in their eye, and it tends to make for a better story. Now, whether you are taken out and survive or you concede, there is kind of a silver lining because you cash out. Now, what that means is if you're removed from a conflict either way, you get 1 fate point for every consequence you took in that conflict, because you getting taken out is kind of a compel on those consequences. If you get a concession, for instance, you might be looking at your sheet like, okay, I've taken a mild, a moderate, and severe. I don't want to die here, so I'm going to get taken out. So you get 3. So there's a lot of kind of give and take where the battle is not you against the GM, and really in any RPG it shouldn't be, but it's more about telling the story and kind of negotiating and figuring out how it works together. And I'll say, I'm probably going to do spellcasting next because every time I asked somebody what they wanted out of this video, they said, explain evocation. So look forward to that video, and I'll see you guys soon.